On our way back from the Daniel Boone backcountry byway trip, we noted a funny squeaky noise on our front axle, and when we got home we found that the tube seal that we had put in had spun. So over there is the tube seal. And what it does is it prevents dirt from going onto the inner axle tube. The actual sealing of the oil in the center portion is done through two seals, one over here and one over here. And just before the Daniel Boone backcountry byway trip, we replaced both axle seals and we added the tube seal, and this one has spun. So part of our maintenance is to get that tube seal out and replace it.
Before we start doing any work, it's probably best to wash all that Daniel Boone mud off the Jeep.
Okay, so to get the tube seal, we have to take the wheel off. So with the wheel off, we can now see the rotor and the caliper. Next thing we need to do is to take the caliper off. There's two bolts at the back to undo that.
Two things to note. It's not necessary to undo the banjo bolt on the brake drop hose, as we don't want to drain the brake fluid out. And secondly, we need to tie that caliper up to a suspension component using a zip tie so it does not hang on the brake drop hose.
Right, so with the caliper out the way, we now take the rotor off. With the rotor off, you'll see the hub and the drive shaft, which is held on by this hub nut. But because we want to pull the drive shaft and the hub, I'm going to undo the three bolts at the back here. I have a 12 point number 13, which is the right tool for the job. Let's see if we can get these out. And first one loose. Second one loose. And the last one at the back. Right, because I undid this recently, we should just be able to slide this whole thing right out. And there we go. There is your hub and drive shaft all together as a unit. So you can see here is the old tube seal that's been damaged. Pull it out, put it in the light, and you'll see how badly worn it is over there. So now we're going to inspect the bore, check that the bore is still good. Yep, not great. We'll clean it out and it'll be fine. So you can see here the difference between the old damaged axle seal and the new undamaged one. Still got good sealing surfaces over here, while this one has been eaten away totally. And on the tube side, you can see this has been moving around or spinning inside of the axle tube where it shouldn't be. This one is still brand new. So the hope is as we press this one in, it'll grip, it'll stand still, and the axle will spin on the seals on the inside. The grease zerk is to provide grease on the inside here so that you've got a lubrication on the inside of the surface. So tube seals are controversial. One thought is you put this seal in between the axle tube and the axle shaft, and that will prevent any dirt getting into the axle tube and storing up a place for corrosion. The other thought is by putting this axle tube seal in, that you don't allow the water or dirt to drain out, thereby trapping it inside the axle and allowing it to corrode on the inside. So I've never used axle seals before. This was the first time I've ever used an axle seal. I'm going to try it again and make my own mind up whether or not I like them.
Before we start reassembly, I like to clean and remove as much dirt and debris, old oil and grease as I can. You want to pay special attention to cleaning your splines and seal section. The seal section is where the inner axle seal runs, and it separates the differential oil from the axle tube. So your axle tube on this side and your oil sitting on the spline side. Also, you'll see that these marks are from the induction hardening where they hardened the shaft. This is still the original standard shaft, and at some point I'll upgrade to stronger shafts.
So to reassemble, first thing I'm going to do is is just put a little bit of grease onto the tube seal. So you can see the grease coming through over there into the seal. What this will do is it will lubricate the seal and make it easier to slide over the axle shaft. Seal lubed, tube seal lubed. We're going to install it, and I've decided to put the grease zerk facing backwards. Oh yeah, nice and tight inside of there. Okay, again we'll just check that this is well lubed, and then we'll put some lube onto the shaft itself just to help it slide down as we slide it down. Also put a little bit over here onto the inner seal surface there. Just help protect that. Right, now we will slide the shaft back down the tube so it goes back in through the seal all the way back down. The difficult bit now is we've got to make sure that on the inside of the differential right at the back that we don't damage the inner seal, because if we damage the inner seal we're going to have differential oil running out of the end here. So the best way to try and do that is just gently feel it in. So you feel it engage the seal there on that side now, on the inner, and it should go straight onto the splines like it is done. And I can actually see the drive shaft turning when I rotate this, because the other wheel is still. If I rotate this side wheel, I expect to see the drive shaft turn. So I know my spines are engaged, and we can just knock it into place. Orientate the dust seal correctly like this, and put the bolts back in again. First thing I'll do is I'll make sure that all three bolts catch on the threads. It might be difficult to get them on, so we definitely don't want to torque them all up before they've engaged. Okay. So if the hub separates from the knuckle, we're going to have a wheel off, and it's going to pull the whole drive shaft out while we're driving. So very important that these three bolts that we undid, we torque back up to the correct specification, which in this case, according to the book I have, is 75 foot-pounds. This is my personal opinion. I like to put a very small bit of never seize on between the surface and the disc. Make it easier for me next time I have to take it off. You don't need much, otherwise it's going to spread into the rotor, which we don't want to have either. So just a small smear should be enough, and I'll put it on the inside so that the centrifugal force and pull it to the outside. Before I put the caliper on, I just want to give this tube seal some grease, and I'll show you what it's going to look like. So we're just going to add a little bit of grease so we see it coming out of the tube seal. Right, so way too much coming out of the bottom there. That's not what you want to have. You just want a small little bit coming out. But we'll wipe that clean. What's done is done. Right, I'm going to put the brake caliper back on again. Put our zip tie. So something that's important to note with brakes is when you're putting it on, the bleed screw always needs to be at the top end. If the bleed screw is at the bottom side, when the air comes to get out, it goes and gets trapped in the top half of the brake piston. So make sure that your bleed screw is at the top. Not so important now because I know this is the right way around, But if you had to replace your calipers, it's something that you need to check. Other thing to bear in mind is that we need to lube these bolts, make sure that they can slide easily, because these are actually sliders inside of here. So we'll put just a little bit of receives inside of there, make sure that they can slide, make sure that the boots are seated properly to keep them clean. I'm also just going to put a lick of receives into these perches here where the brake pads sit, just to help them slide just a little. Okay, now I'll put it back together. The first thing we do is at the bottom, we've got a notch, slide it over the rotor, and make sure that we seat that notch onto these bottom pads, which didn't happen this time. So the notch is seated there. Now we can drive it all the way in, make sure that the sliders are clear, and then lubrication on these bolts, just a little.
The caliper bolts screw into the knuckle, which tends to strip if they're over torqued, so make sure that you don't torque them over 11 foot-pounds.
Click. And because we didn't open the brakes, I won't need to bleed the brakes. So we're almost done. And clean up the tools here, and then we can put the wheel back on again. And we should be able to spin this with the drive shaft turning, so I know my drive shaft is engaged. Good. The last thing we need to do is to put the tire back on.
I like to make sure that the wheel nuts are torqued up. My book gives a value of 75 foot-pounds, and remember to use a star pattern, so torque one nut, skip one nut, torque one nut, skip one nut.
And there we go, tube seal changed. I'll take it out for a quick drive and make sure that all's good to go.